Thank you for inviting me, David. I've timed this talk at just under an hour, but it is a bit of a gallop. So you will have to hang on in there in order to get through it all in time, because I really don't like overshooting. The bugger in question in the title is Herbert Horatio Kitchener, and the saying was by William Robertson, who was rather fond of using the vernacular when speaking to some of the toffs, because he knew it kind of shocked them and brought the point home. But it was the end moment of a difficult conversation that had gone all night in this building here. This is the Hotel Crillon in Paris. It's still there, as you can see. And last time I checked on booking.com, it was 1,600 quid a night. But what it was on the 9th to 12th, 9th to 10th December 1915, was the scene of a crunch negotiation between, on one hand, Kitchener, and on the other hand, William Robertson, about who should be the chief military advisor to the government. And as I'm sure, sort of plot spoiler, that actually it's Kitchener who loses the powers and Robertson who gains them. And it was the end stage of a process that didn't start in kind of December 1914 with the creation of trench warfare. It actually began in the early 1900s. And what we're going to do is track the process from the beginning of the early 1900s through to the war, through to this meeting. But we're going to start with the meeting itself and then work our way forward towards it. So in the Hotel Crillon on the night of the 9th was Kitchener and Robertson. Kitchener was in the library. Robertson was on the first floor. Scuttling in between as a kind of intermediary was Lord Esher, who pops up at various times in this story, who was like an eminence grise and sort of chief factotum within the defence establishment. And he was there at Kitchener's invite because he was Kitchener's man in Paris. Asquith, the Prime Minister, wanted to appoint Robertson as Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He wanted proper, independent, army-based military advice to the government. At the point in 1915, that situation did not exist. The trouble was, for Asquith anyway, that Robertson had conditions. Unless the structure was changed in London so that he had full authority, he was not prepared to make the move and quite content to stay in France. The problem for Asquith was that those conditions that Robertson demanded meant a humiliation, degradation for Kitchener. He would lose all authority. Kitchener's position was actually that after a tough year, he was in quite an emotionally fragile position. He realized he was going to be downgraded, but he was a Victorian gentleman at heart. And in those conditions, a Victorian gentleman faced with such a humiliation would resign. But Asquith had made it absolutely clear that his presence in the government was needed, even if he was placed in a humiliatingly weak position. So he had to just, in the end, suck it up. And as a result, early in the hours of the sort of 10th, he told Esher to tell Robertson that he had accepted Robertson's terms and conditions. Robertson, on receiving the news, walked down the corridor, popped his head through the door of a friend's room and said, "The bugger's signed." What had he signed? He'd signed something called the Kitchener-Robertson Agreement. And along with the support of the unionist ministers within government, it was the two props that sustained the army's domination of strategy for the 2 years that followed this meeting. It's a 5-page document. According to Esher, it read like a treaty between two countries. It's a formal legal document, not like I say between two colleagues. So I've tried to express it, and I will try and go through it as quickly as possible, in the form of this Venn diagram. Under the terms that Robertson demanded, certain things were left still with the government. In particular, the decision where the army should fight, whether they fought in Gallipoli or on the Western Front. That was retained within the government. As you can see, pretty well everything else was left to the army, with Robertson in the position of Chief of the Imperial General Staff in the middle. The problem for the government, anyway, was that Robertson's terms included the clauses that all military advice would be from him, and all communications would be through him. This meant if you got Cousin Eric serving in the Hussars, who was writing you letters direct from the front, not any longer. They all had to go via Robertson, which means although the government notionally had the control over where the army fought, because he controlled information and advice, in the end, it was Robertson and the army deciding where the army fought. Now, Robertson had this mantra, which you can see bottom left. It was in a letter to Archibald Murray in November 1950. War is a one-man show. Robertson knew he could not report to one person, but he'd be happy working to the small government war committee, which was half a dozen people, but he absolutely vetoed working to the cabinet. And so what he's got there is as near as damn it as he can get it. War is a one-man show, and basically the one man is him. Now, there was a couple of tricky problems in the negotiations, and this is mainly why it went on until the early hours of the morning, was that it was a requirement that the man signing the orders should be in Parliament. It was a constitutional element. Now, Robertson was insistent on signing the orders, mainly because he was aware he was junior in ranking to the likes of Haig, and he wanted to be signing the orders in order to ensure his authority. But he couldn't sign the orders because he wasn't in Parliament. And the fudge that was agreed, and Robertson was not a man to do fudges, was that Robertson signed them over Kitchener's signature. But to avoid a little loophole appearing, Kitchener and Robertson had an unwritten, just a spoken agreement, which was called Our Agreement, whereby Kitchener would always support Robertson when they were interacting with the politicians. Now, when this agreement was sent back to the cabinet, there was uproar. The politicians could see that their authority had effectively been taken from them and given to Robertson, but they were so desperate to be shot of Kitchener, eventually they agreed. Now, it's a pretty good rule, if you've got a man down, just kick them to make sure. And Robertson, realizing he was on top in these negotiations, also insisted on an order in council, which gave this agreement the enforcement of law. And it was the biggest single reason why Lloyd George was unable to undo it when he became War Minister later in the year. So that was kind of the end game. This is where it ended. This agreement, the army now firmly in charge of strategy. How did we get there is the next question. Well, I'm sure when you signed up for this thing, many of you would have thought, well, we're going to be doing Easterners versus Westerners and all of that stuff. Well, as you can see, Hugh Strawn, in a speech I saw to the Parliamentary History Society, wanted to assign Easterners versus Westerners to the dustbin of history. And his reasoning behind it was that actually this is a false divide, that actually almost all the politicians, all the key decision makers were actually both Easterners and Westerners at the same time. They all knew pretty much that in the end, the war was going to have to be fought against Germany in Western Europe. But for the meantime, they wanted to pursue tactical opportunities or other opportunities in the East. And so was sort of both Easterner and Westerner at the same time. The true divide, I think, is in these two statements I've constructed beneath. These are the two trends we're going to follow, these two strands we're going to follow over the next sort of 10 years from 1905. And the first one is that the British strategy which in the 19th century had very much had a colonial focus, using the army in penny packets, changes. In the Victorian era, if there was a problem with the Ashanti, you sent Wolsey. If there was a problem in India, you sent Roberts. There was the Crimea, there was the Indian Mutiny, there was the Boer War, there was Khartoum, there was Omdurman. It's all colonial and the army being used in bits and bobs. After 1902, 1903, increasingly, the army says the main war, the war that's coming, the big commitment is fighting Germany, and that is our sole concern. And everything else takes pretty much second place. The second trend we're going to be following that comes together in the Hotel Crillon is the increasing professionalization of the army. It's increasing efficiency and better organization at the top, which included characters like Grierson, Henry Wilson, William Robertson, who were good at the corridors of power. And we will see these two trends working together through the story until 1915, when it suddenly goes into reverse. But that's in the future. So let's have a look first at the starting point of this thing, the Continental Commitment. The Continental Commitment, phrase coined by the historian Michael Howard, in which he looked at the long-term way in which Britain engaged with Europe. Now, in 1888, 1891, the then Secretary of State for Defence, Edward Stanhope, tried to set out just what the army's priorities should be. And here you can see support of the civil power, then two colonial commitments, home defence, and then finally, right at the bottom, and barely 50,000 men, there is a strategic reserve, which is not even actually specifically for Europe. By 1914, up in number 2 is actually a BEF of 150,000, 3 times bigger, explicitly for the purpose of only fighting in Europe. That's its sole purpose. So that is the big change over time. When we come to look at the professionalizing issue, the key man is Isha. Strange as it may seem, the issue of army reform had been a real hot potato politically since the death of Gordon in Khartoum in 1885, through to probably the Haldane reforms, pretty much put it finally to bed. So well over 20 years of discussion. There were several commissions of inquiry, a royal commission, the committees of inquiry, and obviously the Boer War brought matters to a head, or the perception of poor performance in the Boer War. Now, the War Office got quite a bad crit out of the early failures in the Boer War, completely undeservedly. If anybody deserved the blame, it was the commanders in the field. But after the war was finished, Balfour decided to get hold of this issue and sort out the War Office. So he asked Isha, who'd already produced some recommendations, not to produce the usual list of recommendations, but actually to do it, to do a hatchet job on the War Office, and in particular, to create a general staff, which he did between 1903 and 1904. And this organization, the General Staff, based loosely on the German model, was supposed to be the brains of the army, thinking forward and planning for the future. And the post of Chief of the General Staff, later to be Chief of the Imperial General Staff, was created at the same time. However, it was not, to everybody at least, a self-evidently good thing. Picture below is Henry Campbell Bannerman, later Prime Minister, but Secretary of State for War under Gladstone and Rosebery. He'd been a member of one of these many commissions into the army, the Hartington Commission. The Hartington Commission had specifically recommended a general staff, the creation of a general staff, but it had been booted into the long grass. Campbell Bannerman was a dissenting opinion. He had come out against a general staff, on two counts. The first one was that in his view, a general staff would eventually start taking power away from the elected politicians, that they would have less responsibility over key decisions. And secondly, that a general staff would eventually settle on one solution to the problem, and the politicians would be given no choice. In both these predictions, he was extremely prescient, and it's exactly what you see at the Hotel Crillon. Now, the pace picks up in 1902, when William Robertson, who kind of bookends our story, William Robertson writes a paper. He's at that point a colonel in the intelligence department. He writes a paper in which he identifies Germany as the main strategic threat to the British. His point was that ideally, Britain should seek some kind of accommodation with Germany, similar to what had recently been achieved with Japan. The problem was that whereas there was lots the British could give to Germany, there was very little the Germans could give to Britain. As a result of that, in Robertson's opinion, the British should assume that they would have a hostile relationship with Germany going forward. The next key date is once the Isha reforms had settled in and they had a general staff and they'd appointed a director of military operations, Sir James Grierson. Grierson decided to conduct a war game, which the starting proposition was that the Germans, having failed on the shared frontier, would attack France via Belgium. And this is a rather poor photo by me of there's quite a large file on this war game in the Little Hart Military Archive, and this shows what the end game was. I'm not going to explain it. I don't think I can explain it, but the point of the exercise was twofold. One was, how long would it take the British to get there? And secondly, what would be the state of play when they got there? And the findings were pretty clear and pretty worrying. It took 30 days to get the BEF completely there, although they got some there in about half that time. And that by the time they got there, the Belgians would probably be almost defeated. Now, a curiosity of this game was that France were not a player in it. The assumption was that because Britain would be defending Belgium, that Britain should join with Belgium. Actually, the big key learning from this game was that the British there was no point in joining with the British. The Belgians, they were too unreliable, too small, liable to be almost defeated. They had to join with the main player, which was the French, and that would require a change of policy on the part of the politicians. Now, one minor side part to this story is that the German army in this game was led by Robertson. He played the part of Schlieffen, if you like, and in the course of the game essentially lost control of his right wing, which is essentially what happened to the Germans in 1914. But anyway, as a result of this war game, Sir James Grierson, the director of military operation, went for a horse ride, which is slightly ironical because Grierson wasn't a keen horseman. This is now the end of 1905. It's December 1905. And while the politicians are concerned with the general election that took place at the end of January 1906, senior figures within the British military establishment started putting out feelers to the French about some form of military partnership. And one of those was James Grierson going for his horse ride one morning in December and accidentally on purpose meeting Major Houjuet, the French military attaché. Pretty much on the spot, Grierson offered 100,000 troops, a suspiciously round number, one has to say, and actually got very little in the way of promise in return. There were other feelers put out at the same time. Now, these talks were highly confidential. A tiny number of people knew about them. Asquith probably didn't find out about them until he became Prime Minister. They were a revolution in policy in an attempt to get the military appreciation in liable with the likely policy, the wanted policy outcome. The government was pursuing a form of military alliance, no matter how loose, with France, and that hadn't been done for a long time. So but the point of that activity was twofold. The big British anxiety, and we shall see it pop up continually in this story, wasn't a sweeping victory over Germany. It was the avoidance of a repeat of 1870 and a catastrophic defeat of France. Everybody was aware that the Germans now were substantially numerically superior. The odds on a French defeat, if they were fighting alone, were quite considerable, even allowing for the fortresses they got along the shared border. So the job of the British army, as they saw it, was to be in reserve, hanging off the left of the main French army, and there to boost morale and be there in case of a disaster. So very defensive setup. Now, in the following years, Grierson and his successor, Spencer Ewart, did the nuts and bolts of a plan and set one up. The whole exercise was boycotted by the Navy, by Jackie Fisher, which was a potential obstacle, which they got around by using a plan that had been designed for sending troops to India. These talks, however, tended to go sort of in sync with the international diplomatic situation. And so once the second Morocco crisis came along in 1911, there was straight away a pickup in the activity of the talks. Now, this is quite a complicated story, which I hope I can get in the right order. As the talks speeded up in summer, so that Wilson visited France in an unauthorized visit in August. He actually spoke to Hougier 3 times in July as they worked out a detailed mobilization plan for the BAF and where it should go. But the problem Wilson felt he had was that he hadn't got full commitment for his plans from the government. And so he badgered, his boss, Haldane, to do something about that, and Haldane in turn badgered the Prime Minister. In the middle of the crisis, on the 23rd of August, Asquith held a meeting of the Committee for Imperial Defence. This was a committee set up by Balfour, one of whose prime tasks was to coordinate Army and Navy activity. Now, the attendee, the number of people attending was, as usual with an Asquith meeting, far too many. I think it was 11 or 12. But it was actually close to being a rigged jury in favour of the army. Who attended a CID was down to Asquith and Asquith alone. He was the only compulsory attendee. And with the exception of Arthur Wilson on behalf of the Navy and McKenna, everybody else was pretty much on the Army's side of the argument. Wilson, as Director of Military Operations, did the speaking for the Army. Arthur Wilson, hence the Battle of the Wilsons, was head of the Navy. He was actually a rank or two above Wilson. But because he was a rank or two above, he was not anywhere near as au fait with the detail as Henry Wilson was for the Army. But that was not the reason why Henry came out the better of this particular duel. The army had a very clear view of how they expected the war to go and what the British should do about it. Wilson expounded with clarity. The Germans would attack, staying east of the Meuse, and it's an important point to hang on to in this story, where they expect the Germans to go. And throughout the planning phase, the expectation was that they would stay east of the Meuse, so east of Verdun, and that and invade Belgium that way. The French would meet them head on, and the British would be on their flank. Wilson presented very detailed planning arrangements. He even allowed 10 minutes for tea at Amiens. He was very impressive. In the afternoon, Wilson, not cognizant with all the detail, but also reflecting the indecision within the Navy about what was the right route, bumbled his way through a poor presentation described as being, by Hankey, as being cooked up over lunch. He mentioned several options, but made no clear recommendation. Were they to raid? Was there those raids to be in Pomerania or in Schleswig-Holstein? Was there to be a blockade close, or was that blockade to be a distant blockade? He recommended a close blockade. Now, people were already aware that a close blockade was almost impossible because of submarines. Should the Navy take on the Grand Fleet? Wilkes Arthur was completely unclear. And the way this story is usually told, or frequently told, is that Henry Wilson was the clear victor of the Battle of the Wilsons. Not true. It's never as simple as that. Wilson, Henry that is, faced several challenges, and when facing those challenges in the meeting was actually quite underwhelming. First of all, Lloyd George said, well, what happens if the French retreat? And for which Henry had no answer. Churchill, unsurprisingly and needless to say, had an entirely alternative scenario. Churchill suggested, well, I think the Germans will actually come west of the Meuse. And what will happen is that over time, they'll become disorganized and they'll lose shape and they'll stretch their logistics. And what the British Army should do is wait, collect a bigger force of, say, 250,000, and then hit on the counter. Now, we can all see pretty clearly that that's pretty much exactly what happened. But Henry Wilson was adamant that the war would be short, that such a strategy risked French defeat, and regarded Churchill in his diaries. Well, he scoffed at Churchill's analysis in his diaries. I should say, as a bit of an aside, that historians, and it applies to pretty well all of them, are over-reliant on Wilson's diaries, which I feel should almost be banned from being used because they're just too colourful, too tempting. But he was just one voice boosting his own performance and boosting his own involvement. But what happened after the Battle of the Wilsons? Well, Asquith was adamant that no irrevocable decision had been taken. They could only do that when the circumstances war broke out was known. In that, he was being naive about how bureaucratic politics works. There was no doubt that the naval option had been ruled out. When it came to 1914, the Navy was used purely for logistical advice. But underpinning British policy was always not Belgian neutrality. Both Salisbury and Asquith had been adamant that treaties did not obligate the British. If a treaty was not in British interests or fulfilling it, then the British stuck to their interests and not the treaty obligation. The issue for the British was always the imbalance between the size of Germany and the size of France, and the risk there was of the French being obliterated. Once you say, well, the issue here is the obliteration of France, there is, or there was, only one plausible way that would happen, via an invasion via Belgium of France. All the other options were whereby war might come about were almost all implausible. That was the one way things were going to happen. And the only response the British had to that was Henry Wilson. So in the end, although Asquith may believe he had choice, in reality, he almost certainly did not. All the government could do, which is what happened in 1914, was tinker at the edges. So what happened in the years that followed? Well, in 1911, the position that the French put the British in shifted. When the talks started, the British assumed that they'd be somewhere around Amiens in reserve. In July 1911, their French Chief of Staff, Dubai, informed Wilson that the location of the British was further forward in that arrow between Arras and Saint-Quentin. That still placed the British in reserve. But then in September 1911, Joffre, freshly in charge, placed the British far further forward to their eventual location in 1914. And even though the Germans were staying east of the Meuse, in the view of both the French and British appraisals, that put the British very much in the front line when the German invasion happened. But the big change is in the British appreciation of how the war will map out, and that Wilson almost unilaterally changes the rules of engagement. The British and the French underestimated the size of the German right wing. They assumed it would stay east of the Meuse and it will be limited in size by the number of divisions that could be squeezed onto the roads in that part of France. Their calculation was that the French and the Germans, on and about the 17th day, would be roughly equal. At that time, the incursion of 6 divisions, because Wilson was talking about 150,000, even though they didn't actually exist, a British incursion of 150,000 could be just what was needed to turn the German flank and lead the way to an Entente victory. So the purpose of the British being there has changed. It's no longer a reserve formation designed to stop a catastrophe. It's there to give the chance of the Entente getting a speedy victory. And it's that which is the key driver in all Wilson's changes to the mobilization process. He quite legitimately gets a lot of credit for sharpening up the whole mobilization and reducing the time it took. The facilities in Southampton were improved, the staffing in Southampton was improved, Cherbourg was dropped as a disembarkation point because it was too far from the concentration zone. His key innovation was shipping across divisions in parts rather than waiting for the slowest parts to arrive and then reassembling them in the zone of concentration, which the French were very unhappy with. But the key driver to this was undoubtedly Wilson's decision that the mobilization had to be faster and bigger. His diaries give you the impression he was just putting right all the inefficiencies of his predecessors. The key driver in this was definitely Wilson's much more ambitious military goals. So finally, almost halfway through, we get to the war. And of course, that strange event, the recruitment of Herbert Horatio Kitchener to be Horatio Herbert Kitchener, I think it is, to be Secretary of State for War. Now, the decision to pull Kitchener off his boat, where he was returning from holiday in Britain, he was going back to Egypt, sounds all a bit panicky. It wasn't really. Asquith had long identified, at least since 1912, that Kitchener was the best strategic mind, in his opinion, in the British Army, and he was going to use him in some way, shape or form. Now, accidentally, as a result of the Curragh incident earlier in the year, Asquith was temporarily Secretary of State for War. He briefly gave the brief to Haldane for a couple of days, but the man he decided he wanted for the job was Kitchener, who he had already sort of earmarked. It was also viewed as a bit of a risky appointment. Let's face it, this was a man with a record. He had a record of being domineering, used to running empire-based operations where he was the total commander, a poor record of being a good team member. He'd had a difficult time with Lord Curzon in India, where he'd forced the resignation of Lord Curzon. He looked like trouble waiting to happen. But it totally fitted in with Asquith's way of working, despite the fact he said after the war that it was a hazardous enterprise to select him. Asquith wasn't a man of imagination. He liked having big characters who took the lead, and then he just arbitrated the disputes between them. So he'd got Lloyd George, he'd got Churchill. People like Haldane and Grey were no shy retiring varlets in terms of the way they wielded authority. So Kitchener totally fitted in with the way Asquith worked. But even so, his first pronouncement at his very first cabinet meeting on the 6th of August really caught them hopping. At that first meeting, he said he was going to build an army of 750,000, 5 times bigger than Wilson's, and it was going to be totally from volunteers. And the curious thing about this kind of continental commitment on steroids was that it went through on the nod. They just said, yeah, okay. Asquith didn't even talk about it in his little letter to the king that he had to write after each cabinet meeting. When Grey had spoken to Parliament 3 days earlier, he had emphasised that the government was going to take extreme measures to assume business as usual, but that the commitment to fight on the landmass of Europe was be restricted, and it would be mainly a naval war that would not have much impact on the population. So what Kitchener was proposing was a radical change from that. However, he didn't get all his own way. He did not like the fact that the army was so far forward. He would have preferred the original location of Amiens, but on the 12th of August, he was forced to concede that Wilson and Joffre had to have their way. And so for 11 days, a meagre 11 days, Wilson's strategy is in place. But from the moment that the British start retreating at Mons, Wilson's strategy is toast. And for the remainder of 1914, you basically see a reversion to that strategy proposed by Grierson and Ewart, Wilson's predecessors. The British are in a defensive role, epitomised by 1st Ypres. They're defending the French flank, ensuring the French are still in the fight, or contributing to ensure that the French are still in fight. Grierson and Ewart rode again in late 1914. Now, I'm assuming there may be some viewers from abroad, in which case a piece of background information here. There is a satirical quiz program on British television called Have I Got News for You? Well, here we have Have I Got Great War News for You? Because one of the rounds in this satirical quiz is an odd one out round. And this is all about December 1914. And the four men in question, I'm sure you recognise 3, Lloyd George and Churchill at the top, Kitchener, a rare photo of him smiling, Kitchener, and the one you may not recognise, Maurice Hankey, who was secretary to the War Council and Churchill's Asquith's unofficial military advisor. Now, sadly, I can't throw it out to you and ask for suggestions because of time, but what the odd one out is Kitchener, because the other three all used Christmas Day as an opportunity to each individually write a policy paper to the Prime Minister, and each one recommended pretty much the same thing: defend on the Western Front and seek easier opportunities in the Eastern Mediterranean, either the Balkans or Turkey. Now, as it happens, Kitchener agreed with that, and in fact, as the year went on, became more and more Easterner. But the big difference was he never wrote anything down, because actually he never wrote anything down. They could never get written documents out of him, and the problem for historians since is there isn't much to go on. So he's the odd one out in this instance. Now, what happens as a result of that in 1915? Well, here are two strands of professionalization of the army and the Continental commitment go into reverse, and we see a reversion to the Victorian model of using the army in penny packets, and it's the politicians firmly in control. The problem was that the issue reforms of the General Staff had some pretty substantial flaws in them when it came to war. The issue reforms, the issue report, the creation of the General Staff is usually given a pretty Whiggish hue. You know, there was a problem, there's a classic piece of Victorian reform, and the problem's solved. But actually, it wasn't. In the event of war, three of the top brass went to France: Macdonagh, head of intelligence, Wilson, and Robertson. The chief of the Imperial General Staff was an administrator, really, called Douglas. He actually died, but was replaced by a complete non-entity called Sir James Wolfe Murray, and all he did was largely demur to whatever Kitchener proposed. Amongst the middle rankings of the General Staff, 34 out of 61 middle rankers all went off to France. Their regiment called them back, or more usually, they had a quick call with the regiment and asked the regiment to call them back because they didn't want to miss what they expected to be a short war. So as a result of that, the General Staff was largely populated by dugouts like Charles Colwell. Now, Colwell was a pretty good staff officer within the General Staff, but by appointing him DMO, he was one or maybe two notches above his ability, and at no stage was able to stand up to Kitchener. The big example of that about Gallipoli was early in the war, in 1914, he showed them a report that had been done by the General Staff, that they thought Gallipoli was impossible to attack through. He came under pressure, and at the next edition said, actually, Gallipoli, it's very difficult, but that's actually an important shift from impossible. The result of that was that the government was receiving no advice from the General Staff, and there was an incoherent decision-making structure. Who was taking the decisions? The cabinet, all 23 of them? Surely not. There was a war council, but that was more like a board of trustees than a war cabinet, and it actually never met once in March or April. Were decisions being taken by the inner cabinet, which was an informal one of Churchill, Kitchener, Asquith, and Hankey? Some decisions were taken by Kitchener on his own, notably the major commitment to Gallipoli. So the second of our strands, which we've dealt with first, the professionalization, it's gone into reverse. There is no longer a General Staff really performing as like a brain for the army. The power lies with the politicians. And the impact of that is sort of unsurprising, really. if the politicians are all in control, then it is likely that the strategic objectives become political. And that's what you can look at their goals in 1915. You can see that that's what exactly happens. The notion of defeating the main enemy in the main theatre of operations, the centre of what somebody like Robertson thought, is dropped entirely. Fighting on the Western Front, yes, there are attacks on the Western Front, 4 main ones, but their purpose is largely to sustain the Entente, to ensure that the French are reasonably happy. This is not about defeating the Germans. This is more about appeasing the French, showing them that they're still in the fight. That's a political objective. When the first conversation started about the Dardanelles, the belief was that the mere presence of the British would cause a revolution in Constantinople and regime change, forcing the Turks to opt out of the war. In March 1915, it was believed briefly that the mere presence of a brigade of the British in Salonika would cause 3 old enemies, Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia, to suddenly act harmoniously in an alliance to defeat Austria-Hungary. Needless to say, that didn't happen. And lurking in the background always is this concept of prestige, that once you were into something, you actually couldn't back out because of the political impact of the loss of prestige, in particular amongst the large Muslim populations in the strategically significant Egypt and India. But at the heart of the problems were that in an attempt to find an easier place to fight, all that happens was you had the same problems in a more difficult terrain with a much longer supply chain, and you killed no Germans. So in the end, this strategy was gradually grinding to a halt. But actually, there was still not a large amount of disagreement among the politicians about it. If you look at the sort of various cabinet wranglings, I think there's only one resignation on basis of policy. That was Carson in October over the Balkans. He wanted to fight in the Balkans. And Carson was pretty low ranking within the cabinet. By and large, there was a general consensus in favour of this pursuing tactical opportunities out east, pending a later attack in the west. The crisis, in many ways, was not in strategy, it was in management, and the man they had as their chief advisor, Kitchener, who frankly was both a nightmare and unfortunately unsackable. Kitchener made a good start. He got the volunteer army right. He rightly identified that the purpose that there would be a long war. This army would be built up, in his view, over 2 years, 2.5 years. And while that was happening, the Germans and the French and the Russians would fight themselves to a standstill. And in Kitchener's view, by late 1916, early 1917, the British would be the biggest army on the continent of Europe and therefore be able to defeat the Germans and, equally importantly, be able to command the peace and be more powerful than the French. Kitchener's army was always aimed at both the Germans and the French. But he got this big army, he may have not got that bit totally right, but he got the big army, long war part absolutely right. He was also good early on in his management by dealing with John French and ensuring that he stayed in line on the 1st of September 1914, when he had a bit of a wobbly. But it started going off the rails pretty quickly. In October, he was offering to the French that he would sack Sir John French and replace him with Ian Hamilton. Not the thing to say in a big meeting when it's guaranteed to get back to Sir John French. And Henry Wilson duly spilled the beans. But the big problem was just the day-to-day hassle of working with him. He was obsessively secret. He tried to micromanage everything with just his little coterie of advisors. He was trying to run a huge war operation in the way that he'd run a small war. His obsessive secrecy meant that the politicians on the cabinet didn't know what was going on. He argued that he had to be secret because his fellow colleagues in the cabinet would just tell their wives. If only he'd known that all but 2 of the cabinet also had mistresses, I think he'd have been doubly shocked. But he wouldn't tell them anything unless basically Lloyd George or Churchill badgered him and pushed him for detail. Otherwise, they'd have found out nothing. He continually changed his mind. The 29th Division was sent in 3 different directions in the first 6 weeks in 1915. And famously, as we shall come to, he reversed tracks on the Battle of Loos. The Unionists joined the government in May, and they expected to be following the great man of the empire, Kitchener, and be giving their old enemy, Lloyd George, a hard time. Instead, it was the complete reverse within weeks. They were backing Lloyd George and tearing their hair out with Kitchener. But so sack him is the short answer to that, surely. And there were rumours of him being sacked in May at the time of the change in government. But instead, Asquith had a real problem, and that was that he couldn't sack him. Kitchener, it's that poster, your country needs you. He was the personification of the war. He was the personification of the will to win. The British army went to fight in Kitchener's army, not in the King's army. The working class in particular were very loyal to Kitchener, and no working class, no war. So there was a very ticklish problem. Twice Kitchener had actually, it sounded that there was news that he might be leaving the government. And in both cases, there was a riot in the press. In May, the Daily Mail was highly critical of Kitchener as a munitions minister. Copies of the Daily Mail were burnt on the stock exchange floor. In November, Asquith sent Kitchener on a mission to Gallipoli. There was a rumour that appeared in the press that Kitchener was leaving the government. There was an explosion in the press. Asquith was forced to close one newspaper down and deny that that was the case. So this left Asquith with a bit of a dilemma. He wanted to be rid of Kitchener, but he couldn't fire him. He had to somehow manoeuvre him away. Robertson himself recognised this problem. In the middle of the tricky negotiations, he said that if Kitchener was forced to leave the government, then he would withdraw. He realised just how totemic Kitchener was to the war effort. Let's now have a look at Kitchener's downfall. It all starts really with Calais. He was already had his card marked. At Calais was the first intergovernmental conference of the British and the French. Kitchener, fluent in French, dominated proceedings. And before the meeting, there was an agreed cabinet line that the British would no longer take part in any offensive action for the course of 1915. It would just build up its reserves. And that was the line Kitchener argued at the meeting. No minutes were taken of the meeting, and the French came away with an entirely different opinion. And within 6 weeks, Joffre was knocking at the door. Rather than holding the cabinet line, as he should have done, Kitchener caved in pusillanimously and allowed the British to attack at Loos. Now, this is even before, obviously, Loos was a disaster. It was actually the decision to fight at Loos that was bad for Kitchener before it even became a battle that was also equally difficult. The second big event was the failed second attempt by Hamilton to make a successful landing at Gallipoli. Asquith, not given to overstatement or rage, was incandescent about this failure, which he blamed entirely on Kitchener and Hamilton. At a cabinet meeting in August, Kitchener is ordered to make changes, in particular the removal of Wolfe Murray and the replacement with a temporary one of Archibald Murray. Then in October, the thing that really was the straw that broke the camel's back for the cabinet, despite the fact that a German invasion on Serbia had long been something that was quite expected, Kitchener was completely caught out when the event did happen, and cabinet ministers were forced to be scuttling around the streets, trying to pick up copies of newspapers to find out what was going on. This was a basic failure of intelligence within Kitchener's War Office. The result of that was a Dardanelles committee meeting, the detail of which we'll come to in a couple of slides' time. But just to point out, the Dardanelles Committee was the replacement for the War Council. It was a more hands-on affair, although still oversized. Now, one of the invitees to this meeting was William Robertson. Robertson had done a tour of the Balkans in 1905 and concluded that it was almost impossible for the BEF to launch a British expeditionary force to launch an attack there. So as an acknowledged authority on the Balkans, Robertson was invited. But there was a secondary motive. Asquith wanted to see the cut of his jib. And we'll find out all about that in a moment, because let's find out all about Robertson himself. Now, famously known as the only soldier to have gone from private to field marshal, although technically he went from trooper to field marshal. He became an officer in 1888 and progressed obviously right through to field marshal in the 1920s. Despite the end of the ability to purchase a commission, which ended with the Cardwell reforms in 1870, actually the number of officers coming through from the ranks was in steady decline throughout the century. Its high point in the sort of 1830s was around sort of 20 to 25%. But by, I think that was a slightly outlier year, but it was certainly in the teens and 20s in the early part of the century. By 1902, it was 2% were coming through. And the expectation was, if you were a ranker, an ex-ranker, that you might get to major before you ran out. Now, Robertson, who became an officer in 1888, had a pretty tough first 3 years. He could only be an officer by going to India because the cost of living was cheaper. The exams to become an officer, very straightforward for a bright soldier. And anyway, it was bad form for one regiment to reject another regiment's recommendation. But it was the cost of living thereafter, the cost of being an officer in the officer's mess, and the equipment and the tackle and all of that sort of stuff. And Robertson worked out what he had to earn, and even then he got it horribly wrong. But he learned 6 languages while in India, which all earned him extra money, but drank water in the bar while everybody else drank champagne. The big break and the big move in Robertson's career was not actually becoming an officer. It was actually his decision in 1891 to take a punt at being an intelligence officer. He'd actually already been offered an opportunity in signals, where he would have undoubtedly done well because he was very good at signals. But he opted to take a temporary posting at Simla in intelligence, and it was intelligence he really blossomed. He may have been a good soldier, good cavalry officer, good signals officer. He was a superb intelligence officer, and probably the best we produced before the war. When Isha was putting together the General Staff, he asked for an independent report on the caliber of the staff that was existing in the War Office. the report came back that of the 30 officers then employed, only 12 were any good. The 12th was actually George Milne, who later went on to command in the Balkans, but number one was Robertson. It should, just for the record, be stated that the man making the report was Reppington, who was a bit of a chum of Robertson's, but I still think it was a pretty fair reflection. He was a successful senior officer, and in fact, in 1912, 1913, the Secretary of State for War, Seeley, was talking of Robertson becoming the head of the army, the commander-in-chief, or the chief of the Imperial General Staff, even then. When the war came, he's one of the few officers to cover himself with glory. He was an efficient quartermaster general, and he was an efficient chief of staff to Sir John French, a man he didn't particularly like working for. But this is where it gets quite interesting, because for the first 6 months of the year, it's pretty clear where Robertson stands in the way he thinks the war should be fought. He's very much in the step-by-step gradualist mold. He's not a bite and hold, more a sort of bite and bite. His central argument is that the Germans have no citadel to defend. They can always just retreat if they're put under pressure. In fact, the Western Front was like an elastic band. Under pressure, the Germans will just gradually go backwards, which of course is what they did on the Somme, what they did retreating to the Hindenburg line, and what they eventually did in 1918 without their line being completely broken. He likened it, as I say, to an elastic band. For that reason, Robertson said it was sort of almost pointless to think in terms of strategic objectives that should be the purpose of offensive activity. There was no point saying we're going to capture the U-boat pens or whatever. The key factor was the state of the line on your side, in particular, where you could hide your guns. If you could hide your guns and position them well, that was the place to attack. So in that sense, there was a clear difference, which we shall come to on the last slide, between him and Haig, although it didn't really emerge until much later. Haig always wanted a direct place to attack, but even so, Robertson made a key decision in August to change his focus. He stops writing about and trying to influence decision-making about how to fight, and instead focuses his attention totally on what happens about strategic decision-making in London. And part of that decision was his belief that Douglas Haig should be the man that commands the British Army, not himself. This letter on the left is from Robertson to Lord Stamfordham. Stamfordham was the equerry in the court of the king, most responsible for handling matters military, matters foreign affairs. Robertson was acquainted from him. He's writing to somebody he knows. It's a 5-page rant, actually by Robertson's standards, kind of slightly unfocused. But as you can see, he's pretty clear what he wants. No more Dardanelles affairs. He wants French to be got rid of. He's a menace. What on earth are the British doing relying on advice from the likes of Hankey and Cole? They know nothing. That's my words, I would say, but that's the gist of it. He's pretty clear. And this is the starter gun, almost, to a concerted lobbying campaign by Robertson for change in London that ends with those difficult discussions with Kitchener at the Hotel Crillon. He's absolutely clear the British can win the war. He's confident they can win the war. All they need is lots of artillery, lots of high explosives, and they can blast their way through. Obviously, quite an unsophisticated view, but at the heart of it, you've got the essence of actually what did happen. It was the heavy artillery that was the war-winning weapon. And every politician, every visitor to the Western Front, anybody he met in London, That was the message he drove home. He did a side deal with Haig, whereas Haig would support Kitchener, it would support Robertson in London, and Robertson would support Haig in London for the two respective positions. This was a concerted campaign by an army that was actually in open revolt against the strategy and the leadership. And at the heart of it was a pitch that London needed a firm hand, and he was the man to do it. He recognised that even though Isha and Seeley had said that he could become the commander-in-chief, that just was not possible. He had last commanded something, and it was a transportation unit in 1891 in India, something which Lloyd George was rather frequently used to rub Robertson's in the nose in with. So he knew he could, and there's probably the class thing emerging, that they would accept Robertson as an advisor, as a support officer, as a strategist, but not necessarily as a commander in war, given his humble origins. So, but he looks around him and looks at his peers and says, there's only one person here who can sort out the politicians, and that's me. So now we come to the last part of our story, the Dardanelles Committee that I mentioned. Archibald Murray, as the temporary chief of the Imperial General Staff, presents the first appraisal the government has seen since the outbreak of war, so 14 months before they'd actually seen something in writing. It's an overtly Western-focused document. All other theatres are rejected. The front to focus on is France. Kitchener has novelled this document. He adds an appendix which proposes to send 8 divisions to Egypt. It's unclear what the purpose of these divisions are, but it's an idiotic proposal because this is a paper that points to Europe, and yet he's suggesting taking 8 units to Egypt, which can only come from Europe. The 8 divisions were probably either earmarked for Gallipoli or Alexandretta, which is on the southern coast of Turkey. It's got a new name now, which was always a pet project of Kitchener. So needless to say, the politicians fell upon this apparent looseness like wolves into sort of raw meat, and spent 90 minutes thrashing around deciding where these 8 divisions would go. Murray caved in and just said nothing about anything. Robertson, sitting there as a specialist advisor on the Balkans, when asked his opinion, held the line. It's the Western Front. You've got to defeat the main enemy on the main front. That's Germany. When the meeting was finished, it was just, the matter was put into abeyance, but Asquith had found his man. He'd found the man that could stand up to hit Kitchener. Now, there is then a sort of weird period when Asquith is sick for 3 weeks, and it's normally written off. But I think Asquith lay in his bed and had the time to think about what he needed to do, and he realised he had to do some radical changes. So as soon as he gets back from his sick bed, the changes are quite swift. The Dardanelles Committee is finished with. It's replaced with a small war committee that in the end was little different to Lloyd George's war cabinet. And that was quite an efficient runner of the war throughout 1916. He starts the process for getting rid of French and replacing him with Haig. This again involved Haig being the man who had to do the metaphorical silver-handled revolver, telling French he'd got to resign. He then made up his mind that it had to be Robertson to replace Murray and that Kitchener had to be sidelined. In order to facilitate this, he sent Kitchener away on a mission. It was actually not needed because Munro had already done the work, and that was, should the British withdraw from Gallipoli? The hope was that Kitchener would quite like it out east and decide to stay in Egypt. Sadly, he didn't, and he determined to come back. When the report reached London that Kitchener was returning, that what happened next was reported by Lloyd George's secretary and mistress, Frances Stevenson. Apparently, a messenger came into the cabinet room where the cabinet was meeting without Asquith. It was chaired by Lord Crewe. They were supposed to be discussing the evacuation of Gallipoli. But as soon as the messenger placed the message on the table saying that Kitchener was on his way back to London, the atmosphere descended into gloom. And they spent more time debating that than debating the matter of evacuating from Gallipoli. Kitchener returns at the beginning of December, goes straight to Asquith and offers to resign. Asquith talks him out of it, asks him to talk to Robertson. The first meeting doesn't go well. Kitchener again offers to resign. Asquith for a second time talks it out of it and suggests he goes across to France. When he goes across to France, he should call in and see Robertson. And the stage is set for the meeting at the Hotel Crillon. This is the last slide. Now, it's not a good slide for a television screen or a computer screen. It's actually designed as a handout. It's actually not as complicated as it looked, and it is the last slide. What we're looking at here, first of all, is on the left, you've got the various policy options. In the middle, you've got the protagonists for those policy options. And then on the right, you've got the negative aspects, only the negative aspects of those plans. If people want the document, my email is in the top right-hand corner and I'll happily send you a copy. As Hugh Strawn was noted as saying right at the start, there was no great divide between Easter and Wester. But what Strawn does say is there was, if anything, a strategic divide between the men in Group 7 at the bottom and the rest. All the guys above the red line wanted to fight the war to the finish. They wanted to commit totally to it. Balfour could be a bit wobbly, but generally they wanted to fight to the finish. The guys at the bottom felt the war, rightly, was unaffordable, that activity on the Western Front should be strictly limited, and Britain should revert to an almost wholly naval strategy. So they had a completely different conception of the war and the level of the war. But they were only two members of the cabinet, and they were always regularly outvoted. The block in the middle, 3, 4, 5, and 6, are the main important politicians. And although there were differences of nuance, they're broadly in the same camp. They're looking for tactical opportunities out east before eventually turning west. The key thing about this group is none of them is in the same group as the man they're about to appoint as their chief military advisor. None of them is a real hardcore, nothing in the east, nothing anywhere else except the Western Front that Robertson is. Robertson is much more hardcore than any of them. This is a Starmer government with Jacob Rees-Mogg in the cabinet. So what you've got at the top then is the army, committed overwhelmingly, and a big division between them and the politicians. But what there is also, and it's not apparent at the first, it only really becomes apparent over time, is this division within the army between a kind of step-by-step approach argued by the likes of Robertson and Rawlinson, and of those committed to a breakthrough, which is Haig. This really doesn't show itself until 1917, but is undoubtedly true that even in 1916, the government was buying shares in Robertson, but getting a stake in Haig. And there was a subtle difference. And I shall finish off with an anecdote. The last time I presented this it was to a conference, and I gave this as a handout, and Peter Hart was in attendance. And I walked up to him afterwards and said, "What do you think?" And he'd got this slide, and he got a very angry circle around the word fantasy. He said, I agree with all of it, except for fantasy. And I sort of nodded. But actually, as I walked away, I thought, no, it was a fantasy. They never did break through. Even in 1918, there was never a full breakthrough. It was still just about an orderly retreat by the Germans. And on that little anecdote, I'll finish. And thank you very much for listening, those of you that are still there.
Thanks very much indeed, Ross. That was tremendous. Thoroughly enjoyed that. In the usual manner, if we can just do a round of applause with pressing the hands up button. And Ross, I'm sure you can't see it, but I can confirm that there's hundreds of hands going up as a silent round of applause for you. So thanks very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, we do actually have a bit of a problem here in as much as Ross's video isn't working. So we're going to go into Q&As right now. So if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the Q&A button. John, fire away with your question there.
Great, thank you. I really enjoyed that. But the whole time I was thinking the level of organization that in your presentation and what was happening on the ground, the difference is vast. So I'm wondering, what was life like for the operational level generals and colonels, and the degree of frustration they must have had over this period, and then what avenue were there for their voices to be heard?
I think that's quite a large question. That's the first thing. One of the issues was that Sir John French himself, who after all was the official voice of the BEF, was a bit sort of kind of a wobbly character. He changed his mind every day. It drove Robertson to distraction. And so didn't take the extreme, say, hard Western Front line that Haig or Robertson took. And so the message did not come across to the politicians that clearly. But there's no doubt, I think it's in, I can't remember who says it, but essentially by October 1915, the army was in open revolt. They wanted rid of French. They wanted an end to things like the Dardanelles. And these guys are well connected. You know, people like Rawlinson has got good inroads into the politicians, and they were making their message absolutely felt. Haig, 1 week in early December, went from office to office to office, and at each one he said, get rid of those, put Robertson in charge. So they did make their views known. It just took a little while. I think, yeah, I can give you no more than that. I think at the part of the year that they were too busy sorting out their issues on the ground. It's later in the year, with Luce in particular, that the whole mood changes and the senior officers are in open revolt across the board. I'm not sure whether that's a satisfactory answer, but I'm afraid it's all I can give you at the moment. I will dwell on that.
Yeah, well, I guess the frustrations must have been enormous.
Yeah, but I mean, they kind of got a day-to-day job to do in the soldiers.
Yeah, that's true.
And so you know, and what's more, you're in this army that's rapidly expanding, taking over more line. You've kind of got quite a lot on your plate. They're not political animals particularly. It's just, as I say, towards the end of the year that I think Luce really was the kind of the game changer for the field commanders, the guys like Rawlinson and that, who were basically saying we've had enough of this.
Right.
The French was dreadful as a commander. When Robertson was offered the job of staff, he turned it down. Chief of staff, he turned it down. He said, I can't work with French, and French didn't want him because he was a snob. But French was just the worst nightmare. But being so changeable, it meant the government didn't pick up clear messages about what was coming, what was felt out in the West. So at various times, French gave the impression that he quite liked the idea of the Dardanelles. French was always obsessed with an operation against Zeebrugge, which everybody else conceded was a no-hoper. So the government didn't get a strong feel from the soldiers about what they wanted.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks for that, John. Splendid question. Let's go to the next. James Hayday, I don't think the video is working, so I'll ask James's question for him. James asks this: why did Britain have so much faith in the French military given their poor performance since the War of 1870?
Oh, how long you got? The British as a breed did not. Henry Wilson did, is the answer. Wilson, and because the strategy was overwhelmingly Wilson had such a big influence on the strategy before the war, then they were tied into the French. The issues at stake with the French were this. First of all, it was by far the biggest force in the Entente. The expectation was the British force would be just a helper. The expectation was the French army would be doing the vast majority of the fighting. So regardless of whether it was good or bad, there was a recognition that they would be doing the bulk of the fighting. So it almost sits on top of whether they thought they were good or bad. There was a fear that they would get trounced like they were in 1870. But in general, there was also recognition that the French army had improved considerably. Where Wilson comes in is before he really had much dealings with the French, his own analysis of the likely outcome of a German attack was actually much more like Churchill's. He thought, when he did his first analysis, that the Germans would come west of the Meuse. But his whole thing about being sort of almost obsequious towards the French meant that he junked his own analysis and went with the French analysis, although, to be fair, it was backed up by an analysis done within the War Office that the Germans would stay east of the Meuse. It wasn't so much that, as I say, that they had faith in them. It was just that they were the biggest army. The British army was a small army, and the job was to work alongside them, whether you liked it or not. So as the war went on, the French performed, as well as the British did. There wasn't that much difference. So, and in fact, there's plenty of evidence, obviously by the Somme, that the French were well ahead of the British, but that's a kind of separate issue. I think where they came, where the British also bought into, in their own sweet, bippy way, some of the strategic concepts that the French had recently adopted, even if the French were more extreme about them. So even though the French were talking about offensive à outrance and all of this stuff, and offensive without limits, and we're going to attack, it's the only way the French army fights. No, the British didn't speak like that, didn't use that kind of extreme language. But tactically, the British army was pretty well identical. It also was seeking, attack was the only means of going forward. It was as offensively minded as the French. There wasn't that much difference. And don't forget, the French army was a conscript army. It was a conscript army that scraped the barrel of every possible human being they could find. And so there was always a feeling, well, it was bound to be, to some extent, a less sort of proficient army, because it was a different sort of army.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Ross. Right, got another question from Robert Eilert, which I'll ask on Robert's behalf, which is a brief one. Not saying your answer needs to be brief, but Robert said, do you consider Haldane's abilities were wasted?
I think if Haldane was a modern politician, we'd hate him. He was an old windbag. If he'd come on the television in a modern television politics media, your heart would have sank as this windbag came on and buffooned on. But he was a very effective politician, and he had the ear of Asquith. He was Secretary of State for War. He wanted to be Lord Chancellor, but they made him Secretary of State for War. He forced through the creation of the Territorial Army against fierce opposition. Haig, who was no natural sympathiser of a sort of talkative politician, was a huge admirer of Haldane and thought Haldane would be good. The problem with Haldane was that he was, in the public eye at least, much too sympathetic to the Germans. He had at one point, I think in 1912, commented that Germany was his spiritual home, which is kind of a bit, nothing specifically wrong with that, but it was taken as meaning I prefer Germany to my own country. And so he had ceased being Secretary for State for War at the about 2 years previously. For 2 or 3 days, Asquith called him back temporarily before he replaced him with Kitchener. That he was actually forced out of the government, I think in 1915, at the time of the coalition. The coalition was forced because such was the feeling that he was too pro-German. He would have actually been a pretty good choice as Secretary of State for War. He did a really good job there. He knew it all inside out. He would have been, and he would have understood the boundaries between the Secretary of State and the army and how they worked. So it's unfortunate that this man was vetoed.
Okay, super. Thanks for that. Peter.
Ross, thank you for that. I thought it was a surprisingly interesting talk, actually. I hope you take that in the way it's meant.
I take that well. I take that well, because I realise it's not everybody's taste, and I was slightly worried, to be honest with you. You know,
I think I can speak for everyone else when I say that you no need to be worried. My question was about the effectiveness or otherwise of the Army Staff College at the beginning of the war, particularly.
I don't know enough about the Staff College, I'm afraid. I can just tell you a couple of anecdotes, and that's all, just which are for interest. They're not an answer to your question. As you know, both Wilson and Robertson were commanders of the Staff College. Wilson was commander 1907 to 1910, and then Robertson followed him. The Staff College had a mixed history before. It had improved in the late 19th century, but it was going through a slightly wobbly phase. Unsurprisingly, Henry Wilson introduced big strategic ideas, how politicians deal with soldiers, all the kind of stuff you'd expect Wilson to introduce. When he left, he tried to cheat his successor, Robertson, who wasn't a wealthy man, out of some money by claiming that some property that was actually in the house that the commandant lived in was actually army property, and Wilson said it was his and Robertson had to buy it off him. But somebody sent Robertson the wink and he told Wilson to piss off. But Robertson had a... Robertson, one other story about Wilson while I'm in passing. When Robertson, it was a point I missed out. Robertson never said it, but he could well have, that if you get the structure right, you'll get the decisions you want. And each time before he was promoted during the First World War, he made either structural changes or made them a condition of appointment. And when he was appointed Chief of Staff in January, he made it a condition that he got his people in and he got rid of people. And in particular, as he told Lord Esher, I want rid of that Henry Wilson. I can't stand him. But anyway, after Wilson ceased being commandant of the Staff College, he was replaced by Robertson. And again, totally in character, Robertson dispensed with all the politics and said, we've got to get down to the nuts and bolts here. What does a staff officer do when he's sitting there in a field with soldiers going here and there, and they've got to be directed and told where to go? The basic functions of a staff officer. There's a very good diary by a man whose name is eluding me for the minute, of what it was like to be in Robertson Staff College. And they were all in fear of him. And they all hated, in fear of the moment where you get summoned to his car and you had to drive along with him and answer questions. That was the tough one. But he focused it right down on the nitty-gritty. As I say, this is not my subject. But I think that was quite a big factor in the state of the BEF's organisation. Remember, the Staff College, it's 32 people. It's not big. 32 students in each year, I think. Or was it 32 even in over the 2 years? It's a small thing, and its impact was still quite, small, all told. But it was good for obviously the top Johnnies like Robertson and Haig and people like that who passed through. They were all in the same year in 1890. Haig wasn't, but 1897, I think. Anyway, sorry again, an imperfect answer, but I hope there's something there for you.
Can I ask a very quick, cheeky supplemental, which I think probably everybody else wanted to ask, but hasn't quite yet. Who were the 2 members of the cabinet who didn't have mistresses?
Well, Churchill is one of them.
Churchill's going to be
Churchill is one of them. He was absolutely loyal. I think the answer is actually 3, because Kitchener, and I count as my source here David Tattersfield, Kitchener was possibly gay. And so he didn't have any mistresses. But so I think there's a mystery third member of the cabinet. I mean, frankly, Asquith did, Lloyd George did, Grey has got a bit on a piece on the quiet, back on the, he's fishing, likely story. But yes, Churchill is one, absolutely. He was down the line for Clemmy. So I don't know who the other one was.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for your question there, Peter. Thank you. Gordon, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you, David. Yes. Ross, excellent presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. My question is really, in what way, if any, did the egos of the British General Staff impact on the French General Staff at the beginning of the war, with all this going on, all this toing and froing and changing of command?
There's egos, and there's a dodge. There's egos, and there was egos on both sides. Let's face it, the biggest ego and the biggest headache was Longrezac by a country mile. I mean, French, at Joffre, there's a very good unpublished PhD thesis by a guy called Parrett, P-A-R-E-T, Canadian, in which he just looks at the first, and you can find it with a bit of ferreting around online, at which he makes pretty clear that Joffre was very good at this. He was actually quite good at managing the British, but the key problem was the army immediately alongside the British was Longrezac, and French. It wasn't so much his ego; it was his prickliness that was the problem. The other missing ingredient in this is that the talks with the French before the war dodged around the most important subject of all, which was the issue of command, because it was such a hot potato. Yeah. So, as my friend told me recently, the French have got, there's nothing in the French records about kind of commanding the British. It's just not there in their war plans. They told the British where to go, literally, physically, this is where you're going to be, but they always knew they were dealing with an independent force. And the whole issue of command, which of course dogged them for the rest of the war until 1918, was skirted around. Right. And kind of left in abeyance. And of course that led to, so the egos popped up as a problem because the command issue had not been sorted out in advance. I mean, if you look at the instructions Kitchener gives to French, I mean, it would have taken a man of greater sort of sophistication and sort of intellect a difficult time trying to ride the two horses of cooperating with the French but remaining an independent command. It was quite a difficult job they were asking of them, and French didn't have the brain for it, frankly. Robertson didn't like the French. He never really told them that he spoke French, which he did fluently. That was just to make sure the interpreter did the right job and didn't try and fox him. So he'd sit there in the meetings. They called him Captain Normal or General Normal. And no. But he would sit there pretending not to understand, but he actually spoke better French than the interpreter. He was very good.
Right, really.
Top man, top man. As you can see, I'm a Wilson fan, a Robertson fan, and I'm not a Wilson fan. I think Wilson's diaries, as I said in the talk, are a curse. They're just too. They're like sort of catnip to historians because they're so articulate and so juicy and so full of quotes. But actually, they're all about him, needless to say. But there we go. Okay, that's how help anyway.
You said, yes, thank you very much. You said earlier in your presentation about the British forces being initially in reserve and were promoted forward and finished up at Mons and kicked it all off there. And were they sent by the French, do you think, just to test the water?
Oh, crikey. As I said in the talk, first of all, the British were not that inquisitive about where they were going to be. They said, okay, we'll give you 100,000. But they never were told. It wasn't until 1910 that they were told. And then they were told, again, they were going to be in Maubeuge, Herson area, and then they were going to move forward. I think the instructions, if I remember from Kitchener, were twofold. That if the French advance, you are to advance alongside them. So it wasn't an order from the French, it was an order from Kitchener.
Right, that's what we're getting at.
You were to advance alongside, but you were not to be exposed and ahead of the French.
Right.
And so if the French retreated, you had to go back with them. And that was where the problem started, that Longrezac retreated and then never told anybody.
Yeah. And that's where we took our first kicking, really.
Yes, there is a little article somewhere around this story that alleged story about Longrezac meeting French and French allegedly saying, what are the French going to do at the river? And Longrezac saying, well, what do you think they're going to be doing? Fishing? Actually, this story is kind of one of those post-fact, almost certainly one of those post-fact reconstructions that is wrong. The main sort of, the person it doesn't originate with the person who was in the room other than those two, which is Spears.
Yeah.
He doesn't tell the story. It's actually, I suspect, or the article I read explained it, a day later, Long was at lunch, and I think he cracked a joke. And then the joke got converted back into the story. Somebody then backfilled it into the story when it was actually a joke by Longrezac to his mates. Right. What did he think I was going to be doing? Fishing, and then it got plugged back into the original meeting when it didn't happen in the original meeting. But I forgot where you were. I forgot where you asked there.
Oh, it's all right. I was just on. We were just
talking rambled off topic
about Mons and why we were there first.
The main thing about Mons is that the British strategy falls apart in 11 days, 4 years of and more. And no matter how good the BEF was, if this big force alongside retreats, it has to go backwards as well. That was the instructions that Kitchener gave, and he was very clear about. Later, it's interesting, I think, that at that point, Kitchener is sort of behaving like the old commander-in-chief. And in some ways, that's how Kitchener saw himself. Up until Esher reforms, there was this post, the commander-in-chief. It was held for 40 years by the Duke of Cambridge. He was the Queen's cousin. So no matter how often they tried to get rid of the job, they couldn't. And he was a block on reform. The professionalization partly came about because he was, he retired. But you can see in Kitchener, he's not Secretary of State for War, and he's not commander in France. He is this something different. He's a commander-in-chief in London. He's a soldier, but actually he's not. He's Secretary of State for War. And Secretary of State for War, he has to butt out. But oddly enough, there he is issuing these detailed orders to French. It was a recipe for trouble. You do wonder sometimes what on earth the politicians saw in French before the war. It mystifies me, because he was clearly not up to the job.
Not fit for purpose, really.
Not up to the job. But he was quite sympathetic to the Liberals. and on the subject of people with extramarital affairs, but that's a separate matter.
You probably owed everybody money.
And he owed Haig money.
Yes, he did. Okay, Ross, thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks, Mike.
So the very last question for tonight, one that I asked for Mark Gardiner, and it's a bit of a counterfactual one, which is always interesting. If Grierson had survived, where do you think he would have fitted into the command structure? A possible replacement for Sir John French?
Well, it's a good counterfactual, and frankly, and I do occasionally sort of mull it over. And yes, he would have been an alternative. Haig was recognised as being the best fighting general. That was the expression that was used, and he was also the most effective military politician, shall we say? This is, and that would have counted against Grierson, who had rubbed up people the wrong way. The thing about Haig in this context is, although he's always slagging off Wilson for being political, actually Haig was the most political of all. But like all good politicians, he doesn't look as though he's being political. But so Haig would have always had the march on Grierson had Grierson lived. I don't think Grierson's view was fundamentally different to that of Haig. He may have not had that dour Scottish go on and on and on thing that we see in Haig. I think he would have been more cautious, more in the Robertson-Rawlinson school. But I suspect it's conjecture. They were all pretty much of a muchness, let's face it. They didn't vary that much. Differences appeared over time. They were a cast from the same background and had broadly similar views. I don't think the war would have been that different had Grierson been there. Would Grierson have been much different to Plumer or Smith-Dorrien? I doubt it. I very much doubt it. They were all pretty much, nobody was that different. There were differences of nuance only. But he was a smart guy, but he wasn't a field commander in the sense that Haig was. I think the way the army structure worked was the only corps that was made up, fully ready to rock and roll, was the first corps in Aldershot, and Haig was commander of that. The second corps was stuff that had to be brought together. Grierson was in command of that. The implication there is that Haig is the senior man and Grierson is the junior man.
Perfect. Thanks very much indeed for that. I think we'll call that it for tonight.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to everybody else for listening.
We've thoroughly enjoyed it, so thanks very much. A quick round of applause from everybody with the old hands up routine. So that's happening again there, Ross. Thanks very much indeed for watching, and we will be running another webinar in a couple of weeks' time. So on that note, thanks very much, and good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle